The box had been sitting in the corner of my closet for 3 years. It wasn't heavy, it wasn't large, just a standard moving box, the kind you pick up from a grocery store for free when the produce manager isn't looking. I had carried it through 2 college dorms, 1 rented room, and finally up 4 flights of stairs to this apartment in the east side of Manhattan. And in all that time, through all those moves, I had never once opened it. I told myself I was too busy. Then I told myself it didn't matter. Then I stopped telling myself anything about it and just let it sit there in the dark, pushed behind my winter coats, collecting the quiet kind of dust that only settles on things people are avoiding. But on a Sunday morning in October, 3 years after the day that changed everything, I finally pulled it out. I sat down on the floor with my back against the bed, the same way I used to sit in a much smaller room, in a much harder season of my life. And I set the box in front of me. Autumn sunlight came through the one narrow window that faces the brick wall of the building next door. Not beautiful light exactly, but honest light, the kind that shows you things clearly. My name is Amara Price. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled, and please stay with me until the end. I opened the box slowly. Inside was the record of a life I had built from nothing. A spiral notebook with a green cover, its edges bent and soft from being carried everywhere. A stack of printed scholarship deadlines, the paper yellowed now, the ink slightly faded. A folded apron from a coffee shop. Morning grounds, embroidered in small letters across the chest pocket. A few textbooks I had borrowed and never quite returned. And at the very bottom, beneath all of it, a white envelope. I picked up the envelope and held it for a long moment before I looked at the name written on the front. Dominic Price, my father. I had written this letter during the first winter of college, sitting on the floor of a rented room while snow fell quietly outside and the old radiator clicked and hissed beside me. I had written it over 3 hours, filling both sides of 2 pieces of paper, saying everything I had never said out loud. Then I had sealed it, addressed it, and never sent it. Not because I was afraid, but because somewhere in the writing of it, I realized I no longer needed him to read it. I needed to say it for myself. And once I had, the envelope became something else entirely. Not a letter waiting to be delivered, but a record of exactly who I was at the hardest point of my life and what I chose to do anyway. I set the envelope down on the floor beside me. I wasn't ready to open it yet, but I knew that by the time this morning was over, I would be, because this is a story about family, about what happens when the people who are supposed to believe in you most decide, quietly, practically, without malice, that you are not worth the investment, and about what happens 4 years later when those same people sit in the front row of a graduation ceremony, completely certain they know how the day will unfold. They were wrong about that, just as they had been wrong about me. But to understand what happened at that graduation, you have to understand everything that came before it. You have to understand a house in Portland, Oregon, and 2 girls who grew up inside it, side by side, daughter by daughter, and yet somehow, in all the ways that mattered most, miles apart. My parents were not cruel people. I want to be clear about that from the beginning, because the story I am about to tell could easily be misread as a story about villains. It isn't. It is something harder than that. A story about people who loved imperfectly, who saw partially, and who caused real damage not out of hatred, but out of limitation. That distinction matters. It matters because it is true, and because without it, the ending of this story loses its weight. Dominic Price grew up with very little. His father worked long hours for other people his entire life and died before he could enjoy what he had built. Dominic watched that, absorbed it young, and made a private vow that efficiency would be the governing principle of his own life. He would not waste time, energy, or resources on things that did not yield a return. This philosophy made him a successful businessman. It made him a provider. And it made him, in ways he never fully examined, a difficult father to one of his 2 daughters. Luciana Price was a woman who loved her family with genuine depth and genuine silence. She understood her husband better than anyone, his logic, his blind spots, his particular way of organizing the world into categories of worthy and unworthy. And because she understood him, because she had learned over 20 years of marriage that his decisions were usually made long before they were announced, she had developed the habit of quiet acceptance. Not agreement, exactly, but the kind of practiced stillness that looked from the outside a great deal like it. And then there were the 2 of us. Vivian was born 17 minutes before me on a rainy Tuesday in late March. That gap meant nothing medically. In our family, though, those 17 minutes seemed to carry a strange kind of weight, as if Vivian had arrived first and claimed something in those minutes that I would spend the rest of childhood half-consciously trying to locate. She was, by any reasonable measure, magnetic. Not in a performative way, not at first, just genuinely warm, genuinely responsive, the kind of child who made adults feel interesting. She learned early that a well-timed smile opened doors, that asking questions made people feel valued, that rooms shifted slightly when she entered them, and she was curious enough about that shift to keep experimenting with it. I was described from the time I was small as careful. That word sounds gentle, thoughtful even, and sometimes the people who used it about me meant it that way. But I noticed as I got older that they used it most often when they were explaining my absence from something. Oh, Amara is careful. She doesn't need as much as Vivian does. She's easygoing, as if carefulness and self-sufficiency were the same thing, as if needing less was a personality trait rather than a lesson I had been quietly, thoroughly taught. The memories I carry from childhood are not dramatic. There was no single terrible moment, no explosion, no event I can point to as the origin of everything. Instead, there was a steady accumulation of small things that I spent years telling myself didn't add up to anything, until the night they very clearly did. I was 14 when Vivian and I had our birthday in the spring. Our mother had been hinting for weeks that something special was planned. The morning of our birthday, Vivian walked outside and found a car in the driveway with a red ribbon stretched across the hood. It was secondhand, practical, but to a 14-year-old, it was extraordinary. She cried. Our parents filmed her reaction. That evening, our father handed me Vivian's old tablet. "It still works perfectly," he said. "You don't really need anything new." I thanked him. I always thank them. Looking back now, I think the thanking was its own kind of survival strategy, a way of smoothing over the moment so quickly that I didn't have to sit with what the moment actually contained. I was 16 when we took a family vacation to a resort on the Oregon coast. Vivian chose the destination. Vivian chose the activities. Vivian had her own hotel room because, as our mother explained gently, she needed space to decompress. I shared a pull-out sofa in my parents' room and told myself it was fine. "You're easygoing, Amara," my mother said, the one time I mentioned it, her voice warm and certain. "Your sister needs more attention than you do." I had no language for what bothered me about that sentence. I filed it away in the same place I filed all the others, the category labeled probably nothing. Junior year, I made the school debate team. This was genuinely difficult to do. Our school's team had a rigorous selection process, and most applicants were juniors and seniors who had been preparing for 2 years. I came home with the confirmation letter and set it on the kitchen counter. My father glanced at it, nodded once, and asked Vivian about her audition for the dance showcase. The next morning, the letter was gone. I assumed it had been thrown away with the recycling. I never mentioned it again. None of these moments, taken alone, would constitute a case. But the human mind is a patient archivist. It files everything, labels nothing, and waits. And eventually, the filing cabinet gets full. The moment I understood exactly how full it was came by accident. On an ordinary afternoon the spring of our senior year, I was in the kitchen looking for my phone charger when I noticed my mother had left her cell phone on the counter, screen up. A message thread was open. She had been texting my aunt, her sister, about something. I knew I shouldn't read it. I read it anyway. "I feel terrible about Amara," my mother had written. "But Daniel is right. Vivian just stands out more. We have to be practical." My father's name was Dominic. Daniel was a name she used only in text messages sometimes, a private shorthand between sisters. But the meaning was clear. They had discussed it. They had reached a conclusion. The word they had landed on was practical. I placed the phone back exactly where I had found it. I walked upstairs. I sat on the edge of my bed and waited to feel something dramatic. Rage, tears, the kind of clean, clarifying grief that I had seen in movies and assumed was how devastation arrived. Instead, I felt something settle, like a picture you have been trying to hang straight for years, and you finally step back and see that it was always crooked, and now that you know, you can stop adjusting. I didn't cry that night. I opened my laptop and started making lists. The letters arrived on the same afternoon in late April, carried in the same mail delivery, discovered by Vivian, who reached the mailbox first. It was a Thursday. The cherry trees on our street were dropping their blossoms, small pink petals gathering along the gutters. I remember that detail because I was looking at them when Vivian came back up the driveway holding 2 envelopes, one in each hand, grinning in the particular way she had when she already knew she was about to be excited. "They're here," she said. We opened them inside at the kitchen table. Vivian went first. Claremont University, one of the most respected private universities in the Pacific Northwest, known for its business and communications programs, its powerful alumni network, and its price tag, which was, by any practical measure, significant. Not impossible for families like ours, but significant. My mother made a sound I can only describe as joy with her whole body. My father walked in from his home office, something he rarely did before dinner, and when he saw the letter, something in his posture changed. He placed his hand on Vivian's shoulder. I knew you'd get in. Then it was my turn. Millbrook State University, a public university with a well-regarded economics program, reasonable tuition, and the kind of reputation built on substance rather than prestige. Not Claremont, but good. Earned, in fact, through 4 years of work that no one in that kitchen had particularly noticed. I waited for someone to look at me. My father glanced at the letter, read the name of the school, and said, "Good," in the same voice he used to confirm receipt of a business email. Then he and my mother began talking about orientation schedules and dorm deposits and whether Vivian should bring her car or leave it home for the first semester. I sat at the table until the conversation moved entirely out of the room. Then I folded my acceptance letter carefully, carried it upstairs, and placed it in the drawer of my desk. That night, there was laughter downstairs. Celebratory dinner conversation, the clink of glasses, the particular warmth of a house where something good has happened. I sat on my bedroom floor with my back against the bed and my laptop open on my knees, and I began to understand something that I hadn't had the words for until that moment. The question was never whether I was smart enough or capable enough or worthy enough by any objective measure. The question was whether the people who were supposed to see me had ever decided to look. And the answer, which I had been assembling for years without realizing it, was no. I didn't break that night. Some people expect that I did, that there was a dramatic collapse, a defining moment of grief. There wasn't. What there was instead was a strange, focused clarity, as if something I had been spending enormous energy trying not to see had finally come fully into view, and now that I could see it plainly, I didn't have to spend that energy anymore. I could spend it on something else. I started searching. "We need to have a family meeting," my father said 3 days after the acceptance letters arrived. He announced it at breakfast in the same even tone he used for every significant communication in our household, the voice of a man who made decisions first and explanation second, and who drew no meaningful distinction between the two. He used this voice for business negotiations and for holiday plans and for conversations about report cards, all with the same measured cadence that implied the outcome had already been determined and the meeting was simply the formality of notification. We gathered in the living room that evening. Our mother sat on the sofa with her hands folded in her lap, her posture carrying that particular stillness I had learned to recognize over years. The stillness of someone who knows what is coming and has already decided how much of her discomfort she will allow to show. Vivian was beside our father's chair, relaxed in the way of someone who already knows the news is good. She had her phone face down on her knee, which meant she was paying attention. When Vivian put her phone down, things mattered. I sat across from them on the armchair by the window, my acceptance letter folded in the pocket of my sweatshirt. I had been carrying it there for 3 days, like a person who keeps returning a hand to a bruise to check whether it still hurts. "I want to talk about college finances," my father began. He looked at Vivian first. "We've decided to cover everything for Claremont. Tuition, housing, living expenses, all 4 years." Vivian's exhale was almost inaudible. Her shoulders dropped a fraction. She reached over and briefly touched his arm, and he allowed it. Then he looked at me. "Amara." He said my name with the same register he used for everything. Careful, undecorated. "We've thought about this carefully, and we've decided not to fund your education." The room didn't change. The light through the windows was the same gray gold of early evening. My mother's hands remained folded. Vivian looked at the floor. "I don't understand," I said, though I understood completely. I had understood for 3 days, maybe longer. "Vivian has exceptional social instincts," he said. "Claremont will maximize that. It's a clear investment with a clear return." He paused. "You're intelligent, Amara. I'm not dismissing that. But you don't have the same kind of visibility, the same long-term yield." Yield. I held that word in my mind for a moment. The word you use for crops, for bonds, for things you plant in order to harvest. "So I figure it out myself?" I asked. My voice was quieter than I expected. "You've always been independent," he said. "That's not a criticism. It's an observation." My mother looked at her hands. "Is that everything?" I asked. He seemed mildly surprised by the question, as if he had expected more argument. Yes. Okay, I said. I stood up. Thank you for telling me. I walked upstairs. I did not slam the door. I sat down on my bedroom floor, back against the bed, the same position I had been in 3 nights ago, and I opened my laptop again. The difference was that this time, I wasn't searching out of grief or desperation. I was searching with the cool, purposeful focus of someone who has just been given very specific information about the shape of her problem and is now determining the most efficient way to solve it. If my father believed in return on investment, then I would become someone whose returns were undeniable. Not for him, for myself. I searched until after midnight. I had 3 windows open: scholarship databases, the financial aid page for Millbrook State, and a plain text document where I was listing numbers. Annual tuition, room and board estimates, books, transportation. 4 years. The total was terrifying. But totals are just collections of smaller problems, and smaller problems can be addressed one at a time. 2 listings in particular stayed open in their tabs. The first, Millbrook State Merit Scholarship, full tuition, available to incoming students demonstrating academic excellence and financial independence. Small number of recipients per year. Application required. Personal essay, letters of recommendation, and documentation of independent financial status. The second, the Sterling Scholars National Fellowship, 20 recipients selected annually from applicants across the entire country, full tuition coverage, monthly living stipend, and buried in the fine print at the bottom of the program description, a line I read twice and then a third time. Recipients may apply for enrollment transfer to a Sterling Network Partner University for their final year of study. 20 students from the whole country. The odds were, by any reasonable calculation, absurd. I bookmarked it anyway, because I had just been told very clearly and without ambiguity that the people who were supposed to see me had evaluated the evidence and concluded I was not worth the investment. And I had decided, sitting on that floor with the sound of laughter still drifting up from downstairs, that I would spend the next 4 years becoming the most expensive mistake they had ever made. Not to punish them, to prove something to myself that no one else was going to prove for me. I closed the laptop at 12:47 in the morning. Outside, the street was quiet, the cherry trees dark against the sky. I sat for a little while longer in the silence of my room, listening to the house settle around me. Then I picked up the green notebook I used for school notes, turned to a blank page, and wrote 2 words at the top: starting point. Beneath it, I began listing everything I had. Savings from 3 years of part-time work at a grocery store, enough to cover deposits and first month expenses. 1 laptop, secondhand, inherited from Vivian when she upgraded. 1 suitcase, 18 years of learning how to need less than everyone around me. And 1 quality that no one in my family had ever identified as an asset because it had never been convenient for them to recognize it. I did not give up. I had never given up. Not when I taught myself to study after our parents stopped checking homework. Not when I trained for the debate team alone because no one in my family thought to ask whether I needed a ride to practice. Not during 3 years of saving minimum wage earnings while my sister received a clothing allowance. I had never given up because I had been preparing for exactly this, even before I knew what this was going to be. I just hadn't known it yet. I closed the notebook. I set it on the desk beside the laptop. I looked at the folded acceptance letter from Millbrook State, still in the pocket of my sweatshirt, and I took it out and smoothed it flat and set it on top of the notebook. Then I turned off the light and lay down on my bed in the dark, and for the first time in days, I slept without dreaming. The morning after the family meeting felt, from the outside, entirely normal. My father ate breakfast and reviewed his emails. My mother made coffee and talked about whether Vivian should look at off-campus housing options in her second year. Vivian was on her phone, already in a thread with 2 girls she had met at a Claremont pre-orientation event online. The kitchen was warm and bright, the way it always was on spring mornings when the sun came through the south-facing window, and if someone had walked past our house and looked in, they would have seen a perfectly ordinary family having a perfectly ordinary morning. I sat at the table and ate toast and said nothing. No one addressed me directly. No one asked how I was planning to pay for university. No one said we're sorry, or we know this is hard, or let's talk more about this. The decision had been made, communicated, and filed away, and now the house was simply moving forward with the version of the future that had been approved. I had expected this, in some distant part of myself that had always been clear-eyed about who my family was. but knowing something is coming and experiencing it are different things. And there was a particular quality to that morning, the ordinary warmth of it, the complete absence of acknowledgement, that I have never quite forgotten. I carried my dishes to the sink, rinsed them, set them in the rack. I said see you later to the room in general. Then I went upstairs and spent the next 3 hours revising my scholarship application essay. Vivian and I spent the last weeks of senior year moving in parallel in the same house toward entirely different futures. She was applying for student housing, attending deposit deadlines, buying organizers and decorative pillows and the kinds of things you acquire when someone else is paying for everything and the only constraint is taste. I was calculating hourly wages against tuition installments and applying for every scholarship I could find that had a deadline within reach. We didn't talk much that month. We had never been the kind of sisters who talked easily, not because of resentment, exactly, but because we had spent our whole childhood occupying different positions in the same story, and there is a kind of distance that grows in that gap whether anyone intends it or not. The night before I left for Millbrook, I packed alone, 2 suitcases and a backpack. The green notebook went in first into the front pocket of the backpack where I could reach it without opening anything. The laptop went in its case. The acceptance letter I had folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had gone soft was tucked between 2 books. I didn't sleep much. In the morning, I called a cab to take me to the bus station. I didn't tell anyone what time I was leaving. My mother came downstairs while I was in the hallway pulling on my jacket, and she stood at the kitchen door and looked at me with an expression I didn't know what to do with. Not quite guilt, not quite sadness, something in the layered middle ground between the two. "Call when you get there," she said. "I will," I said. She crossed the hallway and hugged me, briefly and tightly. I stood in it for a moment, then stepped back. Outside, the cab was waiting. The cherry trees on our street were fully leafed out now, the blossoms long gone, just green and solid and real in the early morning light. I loaded my bags into the trunk and got in and watched the house disappear in the rearview window as the cab turned the corner. I didn't let myself look back a second time. I had a notebook full of numbers. I had a scholarship application due in 3 weeks. I had a work-study program to apply for and a room to find and a budget to build from almost nothing. I had exactly what I had started with the night I sat on my bedroom floor and opened my laptop in the dark. It was enough. It would have to be. I'm telling you this from the other side of it now. I want you to know that from the beginning, that the girl in this story makes it through. Not because everything worked out easily, not because the universe rewarded her suffering with tidy justice, but because she made choices, one at a time, in the dark, with no guarantee that any of them would add up to anything. What I know now, that I couldn't have articulated then, is that the worst thing my father did was not refuse to pay for my education. It was giving me a definition of my own value, handing it to me at 18 years old in a carefully worded sentence, and expecting me to carry it. I did carry it, for a while, and then I set it down, and then I built something else entirely. Stay with me. We're just getting started. Millbrook State University in September smells like cut grass and old paper and the particular kind of anticipation that only exists at the beginning of things. I arrived on a Tuesday on a Greyhound bus that pulled into the station 40 minutes late. The campus was 3/4 of a mile from the stop, and I walked it with 2 rolling suitcases and a backpack that was heavy enough to leave red marks on my shoulders by the time I reached the address I had circled on a printed map. Not a dorm. I couldn't afford the deposit on campus housing and the first installment on my Millbrook tuition at the same time, so I had spent 2 weeks that summer searching rental listings within walking distance of campus. What I found was a 3-story house on Clement Street, faded yellow paint, a porch with 1 broken step, owned by a retired electrician named Mr. Okafor, who rented the upstairs rooms to students at below market rates because, as he told me on the phone, he had put 3 of his own children through college and understood what tuition did to a family budget. My room was at the end of the 2nd-floor hallway. It fit a twin mattress, a narrow desk pushed against the wall beneath the window, and a small bookshelf. The window looked out at the brick wall of the house next door. The radiator made a sound like someone gently tapping a pipe wrench against the baseboard heat, rhythmic, almost companionable once I got used to it. The paint near the ceiling had begun to peel in one corner, curling back in a small, precise triangle, and I found myself looking at it often in the weeks that followed, usually late at night when I was too tired to read and too wired to sleep. The rent was affordable. Affordable meant possible. That was the entire calculus. 4 other students lived in the house. We shared a kitchen and 2 bathrooms and the particular brand of parallel lives coexistence that happens when everyone works different hours and moves through shared spaces like ships passing in a fog. I learned their names. Derek, who did overnight security shifts, Priya, who was finishing a nursing degree, 2 others whose schedules I never quite mapped. We were polite to each other. We left notes on the refrigerator about dishes. We were not friends, exactly, but we were something useful. Proof that other people were also managing, that survival was not unique to me, that the lights being on in someone else's window at 2 a.m. meant you were not entirely alone. During orientation week, while other freshmen were moving into dorms with their parents, I was filling out paperwork for 2 jobs. The first was at Morning Grounds, the campus coffee shop that opened at 5 in the morning and served the particular clientele of people who needed caffeine before they needed sunlight. The manager was a woman named Janet Briggs. She was somewhere in her early 50s, with short salt and pepper hair and the economical manner of someone who had been running something competently for a long time and had no patience for inefficiency or performance. When I came in to apply, she looked at my application for about 15 seconds, looked at me, and asked one question. "Can you be here at 4:45? "Yes," I said. "When can you start?" "Monday." "Fine," she said, and handed me a schedule. The second job was weekend cleaning shifts in the residential halls, 3 hours on Saturday mornings, 2 on Sundays, starting at 7. The work was unglamorous and the pay was modest, and the hours meant that my weekends, which other freshmen treated as recovery time, became simply the other half of my week. My schedule that first semester settled into a shape that I can describe precisely because I lived inside it so completely that it became less a schedule and more the actual architecture of my days. 4:45. Alarm. Up in the dark, dress quickly, out the door with the hood of my sweatshirt pulled up against the cold. The walk to Morning Grounds took 11 minutes. I timed it once and then stopped timing it because some things are better not measured too exactly. 5 to 9. Coffee shop. I learned drink orders faster than lecture material. Not because the coffee was more interesting, but because getting an order wrong at 5:30 in the morning, when the person in front of you has been awake for an hour and is running on exactly nothing, has immediate and visible consequences in a way that a misunderstood economic principle doesn't. I got fast. I got accurate. I smiled at customers not because I was performing warmth, but because Janet had made clear, in her direct and non-negotiable way, that a positive customer experience was a professional responsibility, and I took professional responsibilities seriously. 9:30 to noon. Macroeconomics lecture, room 214 of the Whitfield building. I sat in the 3rd row, close enough to see the board clearly, but not so close as to seem eager in the wrong way. I took notes by hand rather than laptop because I retained information better that way, something I had figured out in high school, and because the battery on my secondhand laptop was unreliable enough that I didn't trust it for anything I couldn't afford to lose. Noon to 12:30. Lunch, which was whatever I had brought from home, or, on bad weeks, whatever was cheapest in the campus dining hall. I ate quickly and alone, usually at one of the small tables near the south windows of the library where I could keep reading while I ate and not feel like I was wasting time. Afternoons, classes, labs, the library. Evenings, studying or the additional weekend cleaning shifts that I picked up when they were offered. Sleep, when it came, averaged somewhere between 4 and 5 hours. There were mornings I woke genuinely uncertain what day it was, and I developed the habit of checking my phone first thing not for messages but simply to confirm the date. In the middle of October, I called home. My mother answered on the 3rd ring. I could hear activity in the background, the television, the particular acoustic warmth of the kitchen in the evenings, sounds I had grown up inside and now heard from the outside like someone pressing an ear to a door. We talked for 12 minutes. She asked if I was eating enough, whether the weather was cold, if I had everything I needed. I said yes to all of it, which was approximately half true. She told me Vivian was settling in beautifully at Claremont, had already made friends, had joined 2 clubs. I said that was wonderful. She sounded like she wanted to say something else, something that lived just behind the thing she was actually saying, but she didn't, and I didn't push her toward it. "Tell Dad I said hi," I said, near the end. "Of course," she said, and then, "He's glad you're settled in, Amara, you know that." I said nothing. "He just finds it hard to—" "I know, Mom," I said. "I know." Thanksgiving that year fell on a Thursday in late November. The campus emptied in the week before it the way certain places do when they're designed for a particular kind of person, the kind with somewhere to go. Dorm windows went dark. The parking lots cleared out by Tuesday evening. By Wednesday, the whole campus had the underwater quiet of a place that has been holding its breath. I stayed. The flight to Portland was beyond my budget by enough that it wasn't worth calculating. And if I was honest, The kind of honest I could only be at midnight in my small room on Clement Street. I wasn't entirely certain anyone was expecting me home anyway. I called on Thanksgiving afternoon. My mother answered after several rings, warm and distracted, the background sounds of the holiday filling the line. We talked for a few minutes. I asked if I could speak to my father. There was a pause, the specific kind that contains a conversation happening in another room. And then my mother came back. "He's in the middle of something, sweetheart." "That's fine," I said. "Just wanted to say hi." After we hung up, I made the mistake of opening social media. It was a habit I was trying to break, but I wasn't there yet. The first photo was from Vivian. 3 people at the dining room table, my parents and my sister. Candles lit, the good dishes out, everyone smiling in the particular way of people who are genuinely happy and not performing it. The caption said, "So thankful for my family." I zoomed in without meaning to. 3 place settings, 3 chairs. I looked at it for longer than I should have. Then I closed the app, put my phone face down on the desk, and opened my statistics textbook. I had a problem set due Monday. That was the thing that was real and immediate and within my control. Everything else could wait. Second semester brought harder coursework and a tiredness that had moved beyond the ordinary kind into something more settled. A deep structural exhaustion that lived in my joints and my concentration, and occasionally in my ability to find anything funny. I was in this condition when I enrolled in Development Economics, a course that wasn't required in my first-year program, but whose catalog description had snagged on something in my mind. Analysis of structural factors affecting economic mobility and individual opportunity. I read that line 3 times. Then I registered. The professor was Daniel Weston. He was in his late 40s, lean, with the slightly distracted focus of someone whose mind was usually operating on 2 tracks simultaneously. He wore glasses with wire frames and graded with a red pen and had the reputation, communicated through whispered student-to-student transmission, of being the hardest grader in the economics department. In 7 years at Millbrook, no one had received an A+ from him in the first half of a first-year course. The first major assignment was an analytical essay. Identify a systemic factor you believe exerts an under-examined influence on individual economic outcomes. Support your argument with data and observational evidence. I wrote about differential family investment between siblings, specifically about what happens to the economic trajectory of a child who receives substantially less capital, social and financial, than another child in the same household. I wrote about starting line disadvantage, about the compounding effect of small inequities over time. I cited 3 peer-reviewed studies and 1 longitudinal dataset from the Federal Reserve. The personal dimension of it was not something I planned. It simply emerged in the writing, like groundwater finding a crack in stone. By the time I finished, the essay was rigorous and evidenced, and also, in its bones, entirely about my own life, though I had been careful never to write I in any of it. 2 weeks later, the essays came back. Mine had been returned face down on my desk, which Professor Weston did for all graded work. He disliked people reading their grades in real time and reacting publicly. I flipped it over. At the top, in red ink, A+. Please stay after class. I read those 4 words several times. Then I read them again. My first thought, trained by years of inconsistent feedback, was that I had misunderstood the assignment in some fundamental way, and the plus sign meant something I wasn't interpreting correctly. I waited until the lecture hall had nearly emptied before I approached the front. Professor Weston was organizing his notes with the methodical efficiency of someone who considered disorder a form of disrespect. He looked up when I reached his desk. "Amara Price," he said. "Sit down." I sat. He pushed the essay across the desk toward me. "This paper," he said, "is the best first-year analytical work I have read in this department in at least 4 years." I said nothing. I was waiting for the qualifier. It didn't come. "You understand that I'm not saying this to encourage you," he continued. "I'm saying it because it's accurate, and I think you deserve accurate information about your own capabilities." Something about the precision of that, accurate information, landed differently than a simpler compliment would have. He wasn't being kind. He was being correct. That I could receive. "Where did you study before Millbrook?" he asked. "Public high school. Nothing specialized." "And your family? Are they involved in your education?" I paused for exactly 1 second. "No. Not financially. Not otherwise." He waited. That was the thing I noticed most about Professor Weston in those early weeks, his patience. He asked questions and then gave them room to be answered fully, without filling the silence with his own words. I was not accustomed to that kind of attention from adults. I told him more than I intended to, not because I lost control of what I was saying, but because the space he created was the kind that made honesty feel less dangerous than it usually did. I told him about the 2 jobs and the 4 hours of sleep. I told him about the scholarship search, and at some point, I still can't locate the exact transition. I told him about the family meeting in the living room, and my father's careful language, and the word yield used in reference to a daughter. When I finished, I felt the faint wash of embarrassment that follows oversharing, and I looked down at my hands. Professor Weston leaned back in his chair. He didn't offer sympathy, which I appreciated. Instead, he opened the top drawer of his desk and retrieved a printed brochure, which he set on the desk between us without immediately commenting on it. Have you heard of the Sterling Scholars Fellowship? Yes, I said. I found it in September. 20 recipients nationally. He nodded. The application requires 3 essays, 2 letters of recommendation, and documentation of financial independence. The selection committee looks for demonstrated resilience under resource constraint, academic performance, and what they describe as, he glanced at the brochure, evidence of self-directed purpose. He slid the brochure across to me. I want you to apply, he said. The odds are, I know the odds, he said. Apply anyway. I work 2 jobs and average 4.5 hours of sleep per night, I said. I'm not sure I have the time to prepare a competitive application. He looked at me steadily. I'm not sure you have the luxury of not trying. I picked up the brochure. It was heavier than paper had any right to be. I'll review every draft, he said. That's not an offer I make to many students. You should take it. I took it. March of that first year. The application was due April 15th, which gave me 6 weeks. 6 weeks during which I still opened morning grounds at 4:45 every morning, still attended every lecture, still worked weekend cleaning shifts, still budgeted my groceries down to the nearest dollar, still sent my mother brief text messages on Sundays to let her know I was alive. The application had 3 required essays. The first 2 I drafted in a week, analytical and structured, the kind of writing I could produce competently on very little sleep. The third stopped me cold. Describe a moment that changed how you see yourself. I sat with that prompt for 4 days before writing a single word. The obvious answer, the living room, April, my father's careful voice, was also the truest answer. And the truth was the thing I had been most careful about protecting in my writing. I had learned over years to express things at one remove, to analyze, to observe, to argue, but not to say plainly, this happened to me and it hurt and here is exactly how. Professor Weston returned my first draft of that essay with more red ink than I had seen on any piece of my own work. You're protecting people who didn't protect you, he had written in the margin of the second page. The committee doesn't need to be protected. They need to understand who you are. Tell the truth. I rewrote the entire essay. The second draft was harder to write and better in every way. I wrote about the living room in April, about the word yield, about sitting on my bedroom floor at midnight and opening a laptop and deciding, not with optimism, but with something harder than optimism, that I was going to build a future out of whatever I actually had, rather than spend another year grieving what I didn't. I wrote about choosing yourself not because you are confident, but because the alternative is letting someone else's assessment become your autobiography. Weston's note on the second draft was 4 words. This is the one. It was the first week of March, 6 weeks before the application deadline, when I learned something about my father that I had not known. I had gone to the financial aid office on a Tuesday morning to request documentation of my independent student status, a form the scholarship application required, confirming that I was not claimed as a dependent on my parents' taxes and that I was financing my own education. Routine paperwork. I had been managing this category of administrative task alone since September, and I had gotten efficient at it. The staff member who handled my request was a young woman named Alicia, who had a neat desk and the focused efficiency of someone 2 years into a job she was good at. She typed my student ID into the system, looked at her screen, and then paused in the specific way of someone who has found something unexpected. You're Amara Price? Yes. She looked at the screen again, then at me. I'm not sure I should mention this, but did you have a relative named Dominic Price come in here? The air in the room changed quality. That's my father. He came in last November, she said, choosing her words carefully. He asked about financial aid options and scholarship programs available to a student with your name. He said he was trying to understand the landscape. She paused. He didn't leave contact information. He asked questions for about 20 minutes and then left. I made a note in the system because it was an unusual situation. I looked at her for a moment. Thank you for telling me, I said. Can I still get that documentation? Of course. She printed the form. I signed it. I walked out of the financial aid office into the pale March sunlight and sat down on the nearest bench and stayed there for a while. November. 2 months into my first semester. He had been here. He had walked into this building, asked questions about how his daughter was managing to pay for school, and then walked back out without calling me, without offering anything, without changing a single thing. I turned that over carefully in my mind, the way you handle something whose weight you are not yet sure of. He had come. He had checked. And then he had decided, for reasons I didn't know yet and couldn't fully imagine, that checking was where his involvement ended. I wrote in the green notebook that night, he came here. He asked about me, but he didn't call. What does that mean? I underlined the question. I didn't answer it. Some answers require more information than you currently have, and the honest thing to do in those cases is to wait. The hardest part of that spring was not the application. It was not the workload or the budget or the 4 hours of sleep or the Saturdays spent cleaning residence halls while other students slept in. The hardest part came on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of May. I was on the mid-morning shift at a morning grounds, the quieter stretch after the early rush had cleared, when the cafe settled into the background rhythm of a few students studying and the machines cycling through their cleaning protocols. I was carrying a tray of drinks from the counter to a pickup station, moving at the pace I always moved, quickly, efficiently, no wasted steps, when something happened that I had no name for in the moment it was happening. The room narrowed, not gradually, all at once, as if the edges had been pulled in by a cord. Sound went distant and flat. My hands, still holding the tray, felt like they belonged to someone standing slightly behind me. The next thing I was aware of was the floor, very close, and the sound of something ceramic breaking, and Janet Briggs saying my name in a voice I had never heard her use before. I had fainted. I learned this approximately 30 seconds later, seated on the floor behind the counter with my back against the cabinet, Janet crouching beside me with a glass of water and an expression that was simultaneously concerned and deeply unsurprised. You need to go home, she said. I'm fine. You are not fine, she said, with the patient certainty of someone who has seen this particular argument before and knows exactly where it ends. You have been here at 4:45 every morning since September. I have watched you eat a granola bar and call it breakfast. I have watched you study during your breaks instead of sitting down. You are not fine, Amara. You are running a machine past its maintenance schedule and something just gave way. I sat on the floor and drank the water. I didn't argue because she was correct and I was too tired to construct a defense. Is there someone I can call? She asked. I thought about the list. My father, my mother, Vivian, Sophie Reed, my closest friend at Millbrook, who was in the middle of finals and had her own impossible week. No, I said, there isn't really anyone. The sentence came out more plainly than I intended, without the usual packaging of self-sufficiency that I normally wrapped around admissions of this kind. Janet heard it the way I said it, and she didn't fill the space with reassurance or pity. She just sat down on the floor beside me, which seemed like a remarkable thing for a manager to do, and was quiet for a moment. My brother put himself through graduate school working 3 jobs, she said, eventually. He graduated. He was proud of it, but it took him years afterward to stop treating rest as a moral failure. She looked at me. You're going to finish this. I've watched you for 7 months, and I have no doubt about that. But there are ways to survive that cost more than they should. I'd like you to consider whether you're choosing the most expensive one. I said nothing, but I heard her. She sent me home. I walked the 11 minutes back to Clement Street in the late morning light and lay down on my bed without taking off my shoes and stared at the ceiling triangle of peeling paint and thought, with a clarity that exhaustion sometimes produces, about the question of whether to continue, not whether to leave school. That option genuinely did not feel available to me in any meaningful sense. But whether to continue in this exact configuration, the specific arrangement of work and sleep and meals that were really just fuel delivery, or whether something needed to change. I thought about my father's voice in the living room in April. The word yield, the implicit sentence beneath the sentence, I don't believe you have what it takes. I thought about that for a long time. And then I thought about something else. I thought about the essay I had written. The second draft, the true one, the one Professor Weston had said was the one. I had written in it that the moment I stopped waiting for someone else's permission to believe in myself was the moment things changed. I had written it in past tense, as if it had already fully happened. Maybe I needed to decide that it had. I got up, took off my shoes, washed my face, and made a bowl of instant oatmeal in the shared kitchen. I ate it slowly, standing at the counter, looking out the window at the quiet street. Then I went back to my room, sat at my desk, and spent the rest of the afternoon revising the third essay one final time. The next morning, I was back at 4:45, but I ate a real breakfast first. The application was submitted on April 15th at 11:47 in the evening. I pressed the button in the kitchen of the Clement Street house, alone, listening to the rain that had started an hour earlier drumming on the roof. I sat for a while after. The cursor was gone, the submission confirmed, the thing I had been building for 6 weeks now existing somewhere beyond my reach, in the hands of people I had never met who would read what I had written and make a judgment I had no ability to influence. I closed the laptop. I washed my single coffee cup. I went to bed. I slept for 6 hours straight, which was more than I had slept in a single stretch and longer than I could accurately remember. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning in early June. I was crossing the main quad between classes, backpack on, coffee in hand, moving at my usual pace. The phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. I pulled it out while still walking, glanced at the screen to decide whether it could wait. Subject: Sterling Scholars Fellowship. Finalist notification. I stopped walking. A student behind me adjusted course around me with a mildly irritated glance. I didn't notice. I opened the email. Dear Amara Price, we are pleased to inform you that your application has advanced to the finalist stage. 50 candidates have been selected from the national applicant pool to proceed to the interview round. I read it twice. Then I stood in the middle of the quad in the June morning sunlight and laughed, a short, involuntary sound that surprised me more than anyone nearby, because I couldn't remember the last time something good had startled a laugh out of me like that. I called Professor Weston. He answered on the first ring. I know, he said, before I had said anything beyond his name. I received confirmation this morning. Congratulations. Now we prepare for the interview. You already knew? The program notifies faculty sponsors simultaneously with applicants. I've been waiting for your call. A brief pause that, for Professor Weston, constituted warmth. You belonged in this round. This isn't a surprise. What comes next requires work. What comes next always requires work, I said. Yes, he said. But this kind has a different return on it. I noticed, as I stood there on the quad with the phone to my ear, that he had used my father's word, return. But in Weston's voice, it sounded like something completely different. Not a judgment, a promise. The finalist interview took place in late July via video conference with a 3-person panel. I sat at the desk in my small room on Clement Street in my only blazer. Navy blue, slightly large in the shoulders, ironed the night before with the travel iron I had borrowed from Priya downstairs. Behind me, I had positioned the bookshelf deliberately because a wall of books says things in interviews that you don't have to say yourself. They asked about leadership, about handling failure, about long-term goals and the gap between where I was and where I wanted to be. At one point, a panel member asked, "Tell us about a time you were underestimated and what you chose to do with that." I took a breath. And then I told the truth. Not the full story. There wasn't time, and not all of it was theirs to hear, but enough. The meeting in the living room, the word yield, the night on the bedroom floor with the laptop and the scholarship databases, and the decision that felt less like hope and more like refusal. The refusal to let someone else's assessment become the ceiling of my life. When I finished, the panel was quiet for a moment. Then the woman in the center said, "Thank you, Amara. That was very clear." I didn't know, walking away from that interview into the humid August afternoon, whether clear was good or simply neutral. I waited for 4 weeks in a state of suspended uncertainty that I managed by not allowing myself to think about it for more than 5 consecutive minutes at a time. And then, on a Wednesday evening in August, I was cleaning the espresso machine at Morning Grounds at the end of my shift when my phone lit up on the counter. Subject: Sterling Scholars Fellowship. Final decision. Janet was at the back of the shop, logging the day's receipts. The shop was empty. I picked up the phone. Dear Amara Price, we are pleased to inform you that you have been selected as a Sterling Scholar. The letter continued, tuition coverage, monthly stipend, program orientation, partner network. But I stopped reading after that first sentence. I sat down on the floor right where I was standing because my legs simply decided they were done being necessary. Janet looked up from her paperwork. She saw my face. She didn't ask. She walked to the back and came back with 2 mugs of the good coffee, the single origin stuff she kept for herself and occasionally very select other people. And she set one down on the floor beside me and went back to her desk without saying a word. I picked up the mug. I drank the coffee. I sat on the floor of Morning Grounds in the August evening and let the reality of it move through me in waves. The relief, the disbelief, the strange ache of something you have wanted for so long that having it feels almost too large for the moment. Then I opened the full letter and read the rest. The stipend was enough that I could reduce my work hours significantly. The tuition coverage would begin immediately in the fall. And there, near the bottom, in a section labeled Program Benefits and Opportunities, Sterling scholars in good standing may apply for enrollment transfer to a partner university within the Sterling network for their final year of study. A list of participating institutions is provided in the attached document. I opened the attachment. The list was alphabetical. I scrolled through it without any particular expectation, and then I stopped. Claremont University. I sat with that for a long moment. The name sat in the middle of the screen, quiet and factual, attached to no drama, implying nothing. It was simply a name on a list, but I knew what it meant. Claremont was where Vivian was. It was the school my parents had chosen as the worthy investment, the place my father had looked at and seen a return worth making. It was, in his very particular and carefully considered framework, the school for the daughter who mattered. And now, through a path that had nothing to do with him, through 2 years of 4:45 mornings and borrowed textbooks and a green notebook full of numbers, and one professor who saw something worth seeing, it was on a list that had my name on it. I called Professor Weston. He picked up on the second ring. "I got it," I said. "I know," he said. "I'm very pleased." A pause. "Have you looked at the transfer list?" "Yes." "And?" I looked at the screen. "Claremont is on it." The line was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said again, more carefully this time. "I'm not sure," I said. "I don't know if I want to do it for the right reasons." What would the right reasons be? I thought about it. Because the program fits what I want to study. Because the network will open doors. Because it's the best academic opportunity on the list. And is that true? I looked at the program description for Claremont's Honors Economics track. I thought about the answer honestly, setting aside everything else. "Yes," I said. "It is." "Then those are your reasons," he said. "Whatever else is true is also true. That doesn't disqualify the first part." I read the program description again. I thought about the 2 years behind me and the one ahead. I thought about my father sitting in his chair in the living room, hands folded, voice even, explaining his logic. I thought about what it would mean to arrive at the school he had chosen for the worthy daughter. Not through his decision, but through mine. Not to prove anything to him. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy to tell this part of the story as a revenge narrative, and it isn't one. I was done needing to prove things to my father. I had spent 2 years building something I was proud of, and that pride did not depend on his recognition. But there was something in the symmetry of it, something complete. The feeling of a circle that had been open for 2 years quietly finding its other end. I submitted the transfer application the following week. I did not tell my family. Claremont University in September looked exactly like its photographs. That was the first thing I noticed, arriving on a Wednesday afternoon with one suitcase and a backpack, stepping off the campus shuttle into a late summer light that seemed specifically designed to make everything look significant. Stone buildings the color of old honey, pathways lined with oak trees that had been growing for decades longer than anyone currently walking beneath them. Students moving between classes with the particular ease of people who had been told, in various ways and from early on, that a place like this was where they belonged. I had arranged my housing through the Sterling Scholars Program, a room in the Honors residential building, small but private, with a window that faced actual sky rather than brick. After 2 years in the Clement Street house, this felt like an extravagance I hadn't earned, even though I had earned it precisely. I spent the first 3 weeks quietly. No announcements, no explanations. I attended lectures, used the library, learned the dining hall hours, and built a new routine in a new place with the same methodical focus I had brought to every transition since September 2 years earlier. The Sterling Scholar designation was noted in my student file, but I didn't wear the program's insignia or mention it in conversation. I was simply a transfer student in her final year, which was common enough at Claremont that no one paid it particular attention. I did not contact Vivienne. I had considered it. We had exchanged occasional texts over the previous 2 years, brief and careful, maintaining the surface of a relationship without examining what lay beneath it. But telling her I was transferring had felt, each time I thought about it, like handing someone else a decision that was mine to make first. I would tell her when I was ready to tell her, or she would find out some other way. It turned out to be the other way. The library at Claremont was on the north end of campus, a 4-story building with high ceilings and long reading tables and the specific hush of a place that took the act of thinking seriously. I had found a spot I liked on the second floor, near a window that caught afternoon light without direct glare. A desk tucked slightly behind a shelving unit, visible from the main aisle but not immediately so. I was there on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week of September, working through a dense paper on labor market segmentation, when I became aware of someone stopping in the aisle beside my table. I looked up. Vivienne was standing 3 feet away, iced coffee in hand, wearing the expression of a person whose brain has just encountered information it is not equipped to process. We looked at each other for a moment that had no obvious beginning or end. "Amara," she said. Her voice came out slightly wrong, like a note played in the right key, but a fraction too late. "Hey, Viv." "What are you—" She stopped, looked at my books, my laptop, my coffee from the campus cafe. "Are you visiting someone?" "No, I transferred. I'm finishing my degree here." She blinked slowly. "Since when?" "Since this semester." Mom and Dad didn't say anything. They don't know. A silence settled between us, not uncomfortable exactly, but weighted with the particular density of 2 people standing at the edge of a conversation that is much larger than its opening. Vivienne pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. She set her coffee on the table with the careful deliberateness of someone buying time to think. "How are you paying for Claremont?" "Scholarship." "Which one?" "Sterling Scholars." Something moved across her face. A sequence of expressions that happened quickly enough that I couldn't read them individually, only as a whole. What they added up to was something I had not expected to see there. Not surprise exactly, but recognition. As if she was seeing something she had known the shape of without knowing its name. "The national one," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, then, "I need to go. I have a thing at 4. She stood, picked up her coffee, and then paused before turning away. "Can we have coffee sometime? Actually have it, I mean. Not just text." "Sure," I said. She nodded once, as if confirming something with herself, and walked away. I watched her go, and then sat for a while without reading, thinking about the sequence of expressions I had seen cross her face. The one that stayed with me was the last one. Not guilt, not defensiveness, not the bright social ease I associated with my sister in almost every context. It had looked, more than anything else, like relief. She texted that evening. Could they meet Thursday of the following week? There was a coffee shop on Maple Street off campus. She had been going there to study sometimes. Did I know it? I didn't, but I found it. A narrow place with mismatched chairs and a handwritten menu board, the kind of shop that belongs to its neighborhood rather than to a brand. I arrived first and got a corner table and ordered tea. Vivienne came in 7 minutes late, which was unusual. She had always been punctual, one of the qualities our parents had cataloged as evidence of her natural social competence. She was wearing a jacket she hadn't fully zipped, and her hair was pulled back in a way that suggested it had been an afterthought. She sat down across from me and wrapped both hands around the mug the server brought, and I waited. "I've been in academic probation since last spring," she said. She said it the way people say things they have practiced saying, flat and direct, stripped of inflection, as if the only way to get it out was to remove every quality from it except the information itself. I said nothing. "I almost didn't come back this semester," she continued. "I had the withdrawal form, I had filled it out. I was going to tell Mom and Dad that Claremont wasn't a good fit and find something closer to home." She looked at her coffee, and then I thought about what that conversation would actually look like, what Dad would say, what his face would do. "What stopped you?" I asked. "The counseling center." She looked up. "There's a therapist there, Dr. Rachel Simmons. I started seeing her in February. She was the first person who asked me what I actually wanted, separate from what I thought everyone expected." A pause. "It turned out those were very different things. That took me a while to process." I watched my sister's hands tighten around her mug. The particular composure that had always made Vivian seem older than her age was still there, but it had a different quality now. Less like armor, more like something she was still learning to carry properly. I grew up knowing how to make people feel good about me, she said. That's not the same as knowing how to do hard things. I got here and the work was genuinely hard. Not because I couldn't do it, but because I didn't know how to do it when no one was watching, when there was no one to perform for. She stopped. The sounds of the coffee shop moved around us. The steam wand, the low music, the ambient conversation of other people's ordinary afternoons. I watched you, she said finally, in high school. Study by yourself. Do all the things you did without making any noise about them. And I remember thinking that was just your personality, that you were built for solitude, for independence, for needing less. She paused. I didn't understand until about 6 months ago that it wasn't your personality. It was what the situation required of you. Those are completely different things, and I didn't know that. We were kids, I said. I know, but I'm not anymore. She met my eyes. I'm sorry, Amara. I know that doesn't fix anything. I don't think I'm saying it because I believe it will. I'm saying it because it's true, and I should have said it a long time ago, and I was afraid of what it would open up. I held her gaze for a moment. There was something important happening in the space between us, something I wanted to be careful not to step past too quickly in either direction. Not the false closure of an instant, perform forgiveness. Not the cold distance of an unexamined grievance. Just two people sitting in an honest room, finally using the right words for the thing that had always been there. I know, I said. I know you're sorry. She exhaled slowly. What do you need right now? I asked. From Claremont, from Dr. Simmons. Are you actually going to be okay? Something in her face shifted at the question, like she had been bracing for a different response and the ground had changed without warning. Yeah, she said, and for the first time that afternoon, the word sounded like it came from somewhere real rather than somewhere managed. I think I actually am. We stayed for another hour. We talked about her thesis proposal, which was genuinely interesting. We talked about New York, which I mentioned I was considering after graduation. We talked about a documentary she had watched twice and a book I was halfway through, and by the time we left, walking out into the autumn evening, something between us had changed that I couldn't yet name precisely but could feel clearly. We had stopped performing a relationship and started, tentatively and imperfectly, having one. My father called on a Friday morning in October. I was crossing the main quad, heading to my 9 o'clock seminar, when his name appeared on my screen. I slowed my pace and answered. Amara. His voice was careful. The careful of someone who has been thinking about what to say. Dad? Vivian tells me you're at Claremont. Yes. Since September. Yes. A pause. Why didn't you tell us? I thought about how to answer that accurately. Because it was my decision to make. I made it. I didn't need permission or input. You're still my daughter. I know that. I kept walking, slower now, along the edge of the path. But for a long time, knowing that didn't seem to come with much in the way of interest in what I was doing. He was quiet for a moment. That's fair, he said, which surprised me enough that I stopped walking entirely. How are you paying for it? Sterling Scholars, I told you. I mentioned it when you called after Vivian found me in the library. I know. I looked it up afterward. Another pause. It's extraordinarily competitive. Yes. And you applied from Millbrook? I applied at the end of my first year and was selected after the second year interview round. The line was quiet in a way that had texture to it. I recognized it as the silence of someone doing the internal accounting of a situation they hadn't been tracking and are now trying to catch up on. I went to Millbrook's financial aid office, he said, in November, your first semester. I know, I said. Another silence, longer this time. You know, someone on the staff mentioned it. They had a note in the system. I see. He cleared his throat quietly. I wasn't sure how to... I didn't know what I would say if I called. I thought I might be making things harder. You might have been, I said. I don't know. You didn't try. No, he said. I didn't. The weight of that admission, not excuse, not explanation, just acknowledgement, moved through the conversation like a current. I stood on the path in the October morning and let it settle. Your mother and I will be at Claremont in the spring, he said eventually, for Vivian's graduation. I'll be graduating in the spring too, I said. A pause. At the same ceremony? Yes. Then we'll see you there, he said. His voice had a quality I hadn't heard in it before. Not warmth exactly, but the absence of the usual careful management. Something underneath the surface of the sentence, moving. You will, I said. After we hung up, I stood on the path for another minute before continuing to my seminar. The oak trees along the walkway had begun to turn, the edges of the leaves catching color before the centers, the way certain kinds of change always begin. At the periphery, working its way in. The months between October and May were the most quietly focused of my life. The coursework in Claremont's honors economics track was genuinely demanding. Not in the way that rewards performance, but in the way that requires actual thinking. The kind that doesn't resolve neatly at the end of a lecture, but follows you out of the room and into the dining hall and back to your desk at 11 at night. I had been waiting, without knowing it, for work that demanded this of me. I found that I was good at it in ways I hadn't had the room to discover before. In February, Ms. Patricia Cole, the Sterling Scholars Program Coordinator at Claremont, stopped me after a departmental event and asked if I had 15 minutes for a conversation. We sat in her office, a warm room with 2 small plants and an ordered desk, and she placed a program folder in front of me. Each year, she said, the Sterling Scholars Program selects one graduating fellow from the national cohort to deliver the commencement address at their institution. It's not based on GPA rankings or class standing. It's selected by the program's academic committee based on the fellow's trajectory, their written work, and their representation of what the fellowship stands for. She paused. We'd like you to be this year's speaker at Claremont's commencement. I looked at the folder. That's not the same as valedictorian, I said carefully. No, it isn't. Our valedictorian is determined by 4-year GPA at Claremont, which you wouldn't be eligible for as a transfer student. This is a separate distinction, specific to the Sterling program. It carries the same platform, same stage, same ceremony, same audience, but it's a different kind of honor. What does it involve? You write and deliver a 10 to 15 minute address. The committee will review a draft. Beyond that, the content is yours. She let that sit in the air between us. I looked at the folder. My parents will be at that ceremony, I said. They don't know about this. Ms. Cole's expression was careful and kind. Would you like them to know beforehand? I thought about it for a longer moment than the question might have seemed to warrant. No, I said, not because I want to surprise them, but because I want the speech to be mine before it's anything else, before anyone's feelings about it become part of what I'm carrying when I write it. She nodded once. That makes sense. I'll do it, I said. Professor Weston reviewed my drafts by email. He was at Millbrook, 300 miles away, but his notes arrived within 24 hours of every version I sent him. Red digital ink in the margins, the same high expectations he had held from the first essay I ever submitted in his class. You're being careful again, he wrote on the second draft. Not careful the way you're careful with evidence or argument. Careful with yourself. Stop protecting the audience from what you actually want to say. They can handle it. I wrote the third draft at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday in April, in the quiet of my room while the rest of the building slept. I wrote it the way I had learned to write only after the Sterling application. With the truth in front of me rather than behind me, not dressed up or managed, just said. I wrote about a living room in Portland, about a word, yield, used in a sentence about a daughter, about a bedroom floor and a laptop and a decision made in the dark, not because the light had come on, but because the dark was no longer reason enough to be still. I wrote about morning grounds at 4:45, about Janet, about Professor Weston, about a green notebook full of numbers and the slow, unglamorous work of building a life from what you actually have rather than what you were supposed to have been given. And I wrote, at the end, about what I had come to understand in the 2 years since I left Portland, that the people who underestimate you are not your ceiling. They are simply people, limited, human, working with the frameworks they have. What they believe about you is information about them. What you do with your life is information about you. I read it back once, made 2 small changes, and sent it to Weston at 2:47 a.m. His response came at 6:15. 4 words. Don't change a thing. Commencement morning arrived in the last week of May, clear and warm. the kind of day that feels specifically designed for endings and beginnings, as if the weather had consulted the calendar and dressed accordingly. I was up before my alarm. I showered, dressed, and pinned the Sterling Scholars Medallion to the front of my gown with the careful attention of someone who understands that some objects carry more than their physical weight. Then I sat on the edge of my bed for a few minutes with my hands in my lap, not thinking about anything in particular, just being present in the last ordinary moment before the day became the day I would carry for the rest of my life. Vivian knocked on my door at 8:15. She was already in her gown, cap in hand, and she looked different from how she had looked the first time I saw her in this building. Something had settled in her, the way things settle in people when they've been through difficulty and come out the other side having learned something that is actually theirs. "Mom and Dad are parking," she said. "I told them I'd meet them at the family entrance." "Okay." She looked at me for a moment. "They still don't know." "No." "Are you nervous?" I thought about the actual answer. "No," I said. "I know what I want to say. That's enough." She nodded slowly. Then she stepped forward and hugged me, not the brief, obligatory kind, but the kind that has some weight behind it, the kind that means something specific. I hugged her back. "I'll be watching," she said when she pulled back. "I'll be right there." "I know," I said. "Go find Mom and Dad." From the side of the stage, I could see the entire ceremony field. The long rows of white chairs, the families arranged in the stands and along the sides, the slow processional of gowned students moving to their seats as the music played. 3,000 people approximately, sunlight on every surface. I found my parents before they found me. They were in the third row, center section, good seats, the kind you arrive early for. My father was in a dark suit, his camera on his lap. My mother had flowers, white, a full bouquet resting across her knees. They were looking toward the student processional, scanning the black gowns for Vivian, the way parents do when they know their child is in a crowd and they can't rest until they've located them. They didn't look toward the stage. They had no reason to. I watched them for a moment from the wings. My father, who had sat in a chair in our living room and explained in a calm and certain voice that one of his daughters was not worth investing in. My mother, who had stared at her hands while he did. I looked at them and I did not feel anger. That surprised me every time I checked. I had expected anger to be the dominant note of this moment, had prepared myself to manage it, and instead what I felt was something much quieter and much more complex. Something that had room in it for grief and understanding and a kind of love that had survived things it shouldn't have had to survive. The ceremony began. The president of the university spoke. Awards were presented. The student processional settled into chairs, and the volume of the crowd adjusted to the particular attention of an audience that has arrived for a specific event and is now measuring the distance to it. The introduction for the Sterling Scholar speaker was given by Ms. Cole. She spoke for 2 minutes about the fellowship and what it represented. I stood in the wings and breathed slowly and thought about the green notebook and the Clement Street radiator and Janet Briggs sitting down on the kitchen floor beside me. "It is my honor," Ms. Cole said, "to introduce this year's Sterling Scholars commencement speaker. Her work at Millbrook State University and her final year here at Claremont reflect the best of what this fellowship aspires to recognize. Not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of purpose in spite of it. Please welcome Amara Price." The applause started before I reached the podium. I walked out into the sunlight, and the first thing I registered was the sound. Broad, warm, the sound of a crowd that has been primed to welcome someone and is doing it genuinely. The second thing I registered was my parents' faces. My father had turned toward the stage when the name was announced. He turned the way a person turns when they hear a sound they recognize but cannot immediately locate the source of. Instinctive, directional. And then he saw me. The camera came down from his eye. My mother's hand went to her mouth. I reached the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at 3,000 people. At my father, sitting in the third row, not moving. At my mother, whose bouquet of white flowers had tilted sideways in her hands without her noticing. At Vivian, somewhere in the student section, who had known this was coming and had kept that knowledge to herself as a gift. I placed my notes on the podium, though I didn't need them. And I spoke. 4 years ago, someone told me I wasn't worth the investment. The ceremony field went quiet in a way that large outdoor spaces rarely do. Not the hush of boredom, but the particular stillness that descends when something true and unexpected is said in a public place, and everyone recognizes the truth of it simultaneously. Those weren't cruel words, delivered cruelly. They were honest words delivered with complete certainty by someone who believed them. And for a while, longer than I would like to admit, so did I. I paused. Let that sit. I want to talk about what happened between that moment and this one. Not because I believe my story is exceptional, but because I think most of us, at some point, have been handed a definition of ourselves by someone whose opinion we didn't ask for, and the question of what to do with that definition, whether to carry it or set it down, is one of the most consequential questions a person can face. I spoke for 14 minutes. I talked about Millbrook and Morning Grounds and Professor Weston, whose name I said with the full weight of what I owed him. I talked about the green notebook and the Sterling application and the night I fainted and the floor and getting up. I talked about choosing to continue not because I was certain it would work, but because stopping would mean accepting someone else's conclusion about my life. I did not name my father. I did not name my mother or my sister. There was no point. This was not a performance of grievance, and they were not subjects in my story. They were people who had their own stories, their own accounting to do, and my job at this podium was not to do it for them. My job was to say the thing I had been learning to say for 4 years, in the voice I had earned the right to use. The greatest thing I learned, the thing that cost the most to learn and that I would not trade for anything, is that your worth is not determined by who recognizes it. It was there before they looked. It will be there if they never do. A ripple moved through the crowd. Someone nearby in the family section made a sound that was not quite composed. To anyone sitting in these seats today who has been told by a parent, a teacher, a partner, a friend, a voice that was supposed to care, that you are less than you are, I am not going to tell you that it doesn't hurt. It does. But I am going to tell you that it is not the final word. The final word belongs to what you do next. I paused. The ceremony field was completely still. Congratulations to the class of this year. You know how hard you worked. That knowledge belongs to you, entirely, regardless of who was watching. I stepped back from the microphone. The applause that came was not the polite applause of a ceremony obligation. It began in the student section, scattered, then cohering, and spread outward into the family stands in the way that genuine reactions spread, not because people have decided to respond, but because the response arrives before the decision. It became a standing ovation. Not immediately, the way these things rarely happen immediately in real life, but within about 20 seconds, rising from the student rows and moving like weather across the field. In the third row, my mother was already on her feet, the white flowers clutched in one hand, her free hand raised in front of her face as if it could contain what was on it. My father stood more slowly. He rose from his chair with the deliberate steadiness of a man who is managing something internal and choosing, with great care, not to show how difficult it is. He stood. He did not raise his hands immediately. He simply stood and looked at me. And for the first time in my life, that felt like enough. The reception hall was loud with the particular joy of completion, the sound of people who have arrived at a finish line and are allowing themselves, finally, to stop running. Faculty and students moved through in overlapping conversations, glasses of sparkling water and juice on trays, the afternoon light coming through high windows in long gold rectangles. I had spoken to Ms. Cole and to 2 professors from the economics department and to a woman from the Sterling Foundation's board who had flown in for the ceremony when I became aware that my parents had crossed the room and were standing near me. I finished my conversation and turned to face them. My mother reached me first. She put her arms around me before either of us had said a word, and I felt the slight tremble in her shoulders that told me she had been holding herself together since the speech and was now, in the relative privacy of an embrace, allowing some of it out. I held her for a moment. Then I stepped back gently. My father stood slightly behind her. He looked the way I had never seen him look. Not diminished exactly, but the particular quality of composure that had always defined him in my memory, the quality that came from complete certainty, was not there. In its place was something more human and more difficult, a man who has seen his own accounting and found it does not balance. "You didn't tell us," he said. "No, you could have." "I know," I said, "but I needed this to be mine first, before it was anything else." He looked at me for a long moment. "That's fair," he said. And then, more quietly, I don't think I've said that to you enough times in your life. My mother made a small sound beside him. I picked up the glass of water from the table beside me and held it with both hands. What do you want to say, Dad? I asked, not unkindly, not as a challenge. Just as a question that deserved to be asked directly, because we had spent too many years talking around the direct thing. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out a small envelope. He placed it on the table between us without handing it to me. I owe you an explanation, he said. I've been thinking about how to give it to you for a long time, and I haven't found the right way, so I'm going to give you the closest I have. I picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper, a single page handwritten in my father's careful and precise script. I unfolded it. At the top, he had written the dates of my first semester at Millbrook. Below that, dates through the spring. Then my second year. Then the Sterling application timeline, with the finalist notification and the final selection circled in the same red pen he used for everything important. Then the Claremont transfer. Then today's date. He had been tracking it. All of it. Not from a distance of ignorance, but from a distance of someone who was watching and choosing not to intervene. Or not knowing how to. Below the timeline, a short paragraph. I made the wrong determination. I evaluated you using criteria that had nothing to do with who you are or what you were capable of. I saw what I expected to see because it was easier than looking more carefully. I was wrong about you in every way that matters. I don't expect you to forgive that. I only want you to know that I know it. Dad. I read it twice. Then I folded it carefully and placed it in the pocket of my gown. You tracked all of this, I said. Yes. Through Professor Weston? He held my gaze. I called the economics department at Millbrook in December of your first year. They connected me to his office. I asked if he would keep me informed of your academic progress. He agreed on the condition that he would tell you if you asked and that I would not use the information to interfere. In a pause, he's a principled man. He is. I know about the scholarship application process, the fainting, the interview. He stopped. I know about all of it. The reception hall continued around us, other conversations, other families, the ordinary noise of a celebratory afternoon. I stood in it and thought about my father making a phone call in December of my first year, sitting in his home office in Portland, dialing a number for a professor he had never met, asking to be kept informed of the daughter he had decided not to invest in. It was not what I would have wanted from him. It was not remotely adequate as a response to what had happened, but it was something. And the something of it was more complicated, more human, and harder to dismiss than nothing would have been. Why didn't you call me yourself? I asked. Because I didn't know what I would say, because I was ashamed of the conversation we would have to have first, and I was not brave enough to have it. He looked at me steadily. I am trying to be braver now. I know that it's late. It is late, I said. Yes, but it's not too late. I looked at him. Those are different things. Vivian found us about 20 minutes later, navigating through the crowd with the focused efficiency of someone who has a destination in mind. She stopped at the edge of our small circle and looked at the three of us with an expression that asked a question without asking it. We're okay, I said. She exhaled. Then she came and stood beside me, and for a moment the four of us were simply together in the afternoon light. Not easy, not healed, not resolved in any clean or final sense, but together, honestly together, which was something we had not been in a long time. I'm proud of you, Vivian said to me, quietly enough that it was just for me. I know, I said. I'm proud of you too. She looked at me sideways. I haven't done anything yet. You stayed, I said. When you could have left, that counts. She was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded, and something in the nod was a full sentence I understood without translation. My mother reached over and put her hand on my arm, not to pull me toward her, just a contact, a presence. I let it stay. Outside the reception hall windows, the ceremony field was emptying slowly, families collecting their graduates, taking the photographs they would keep. The white chairs were being carried away by grounds crew in quiet, efficient pairs. The day was moving toward the evening the way all such days do, the light changing its angle, the heat beginning to release from the stone buildings, everything settling toward the ordinary after the extraordinary. We stayed in the reception hall until it began to clear. We talked, carefully, imperfectly, with the occasional silence that four people who are learning new ways to be with each other require. My mother asked about New York. My father asked about the firm I had been in contact with through the Sterling Network. Vivian asked if I had found an apartment yet. The answers were incomplete and honest and were received, for the first time that I could remember, without being measured against something else. When we left, we walked out into the early evening together, and I thought, not for the first time and not for the last, about the strange arithmetic of families. How two people can raise two children in the same house, speak to them in the same rooms, and still manage to offer them entirely different versions of the world. And how sometimes the child who received the lesser version ends up building something that the child with the better version still has time to learn from. I thought about that without bitterness. I had moved through the bitterness a long time ago, somewhere between Thanksgiving alone in the Clement Street house and the morning of the Sterling interview, in one of those unmarked transitions that only become visible in retrospect. What remained was simply the truth of it. And the truth, I had found, was something I could live with, more than live with. Build on. The apartment in New York was mine from the 1st of August. 5th floor walk-up, east side of the city, one narrow window that looked out at the buildings across the street rather than at anything conventionally scenic. The kitchen was exactly large enough to cook in if you were organized about it. The radiator would turn out to have opinions, as radiators in old New York buildings often do. The floors creaked along the path from the door to the desk in a pattern I memorized within the first week. I loved it immediately and without reservation. The position at Sterling and Grant Associates began in early September. Junior Analyst, Financial Research Division, a role I had heard about through the Sterling Network and spent 4 months in the interview process for. The work was demanding and interesting and required exactly the kind of thinking I had been building towards since Professor Weston's development economics course in the spring of my first year. I arrived on my first day with the particular awareness of someone who has earned a seat at a table through a route that was longer and more difficult than the standard one, and who knows, because of that, exactly how much the seat is worth. Sophie Reed visited the second weekend of October, took one look at the apartment, and said it was the best thing she had ever seen. "It's the size of my dorm room," she said. "I know," I said. "You're obsessed with it." "Completely." She stayed 2 nights. And we walked the neighborhood and cooked in the small kitchen and talked until late in the way that people who have known each other through genuinely difficult things can talk. Without explanation, without context setting, without the labor of making yourself legible to someone who is still learning who you are. "You did it," she said, at some point in the second evening, not in reference to anything specific. "We both did," I said. "Don't diminish yours with the collective." And I laughed. She was right. My mother wrote letters, actual letters, by hand on paper, which she sent in cream-colored envelopes with her return address in the upper left corner. They arrived every few weeks, and I read each one alone, in the apartment, usually in the early morning before I left for work. They were careful letters, the letters of someone who is learning a new language and is not yet fluent but is committed to practicing. She wrote about ordinary things, the garden, a book she was reading, something my father had said at dinner that had made her think. She wrote around the edges of the harder things and then occasionally, in a single sentence, directly into them. "I have been thinking about what it must have felt like to be you at 18, she wrote in one of the early ones. "I mean this literally. I have been trying to imagine it. I haven't been able to fully get there, but I keep trying. I kept every letter in a small box on my bookshelf." My father called every other Wednesday at 7 in the evening. It had taken us a few months to establish the rhythm. Not by discussion, but by the gradual emergence of a pattern from 2 people independently choosing the same time enough times that it became something understood. We talked for 20 or 30 minutes, about the news, about work, about things he was reading, occasionally about things that mattered more than that. He had always been better in conversation than on paper, and I had always been better at saying difficult things in writing, and we were both learning to meet somewhere in the middle. He did not ask for forgiveness outright, and I did not offer it prematurely. We were both, I think, aware that genuine repair is not an event but a practice. It doesn't happen at a graduation reception when the right things are finally said. It happens in the accumulated weight of ordinary contact over time, in the choosing, again and again, to show up in the ways that the relationship requires. We were in the early stages of that. We both knew it. We were both, imperfectly, trying. Vivian came to New York in February for a research visit connected to her thesis. She texted the week before to ask if she could stay in the apartment for a few nights, and I said yes. 3 days. We cooked together in the small kitchen, discovering that we had both independently learned to make the same basic pasta dish, which seemed to say something about us that we couldn't quite articulate but both found funny. We went on a long walk on the second evening, down through the neighborhoods east of the park, talking about nothing in particular and everything in general. We stopped at a record shop and spent 40 minutes going through the bins, and she bought something I had never heard of, and I bought something she didn't understand, and we played them back at the apartment with the window cracked open to the cold February air. "I didn't know you liked this kind of thing," she said, about the music I had put on. "I didn't know either," I said. I've been figuring what it's like to have free time." Something like that. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I think that's what I've been figuring out too. Who I am when nobody's evaluating me." "How's it going?" She considered it. "Better than I expected, slower than I'd like." "That sounds about right," I said. She left on the third morning, and I walked her to the subway and we hugged on the sidewalk in the February cold with the city moving around us in all directions at once. When she was gone, I walked back to the apartment and stood at my window for a while, looking out at the street below. I was trying to name what had changed between us, precisely. It wasn't reconciliation in any dramatic sense. We hadn't processed the childhood or assigned blame or reached any formal conclusions. What had changed was simpler and more durable than that. We had started being curious about each other. We had started asking questions and waiting for the answers. We had started being, in small and genuine ways, interested in who the other person actually was, rather than who they had been in the story we'd both grown up inside. That was the thing that kept surprising me in that period. How much of what I had thought was fixed had turned out to be simply unexamined. How many of the distances between people that seem structural are actually just the product of never having tried. In March, I made a transfer, a sum I had been saving toward for several months, to the Financial Aid Scholarship Fund at Millbrook State, specifically designated for students who were financing their own education without family support. The donation was anonymous by request. I told Sophie, who received the information with a silence that was more eloquent than most speeches, and then said simply, "Good." I didn't tell anyone else. There was no version of telling it that didn't transform it into something other than what it was. A private completion, a circle quietly closed. 3 years after the day of the graduation ceremony, on a Sunday morning in October, I sat on the floor of my apartment with a cardboard box in front of me. I had pulled it from the back of the closet finally, the way you eventually pull out the thing you have been not quite ready to look at until the morning you find that you are. I went through it slowly. The green notebook, the printed scholarship deadlines, the morning grounds apron folded with the care of something that had mattered, and at the bottom, the white envelope. I opened it this time. My handwriting at 18 was smaller than it is now and more careful. The handwriting of someone who was accustomed to moving slowly through things and making sure each step was solid before taking the next. The letter covered both sides of 2 pages, and reading it was like reading correspondence from someone I knew very well who I had not spoken to in a long time. She wrote about the living room, about the word yield, about watching her mother look at her hands, about sitting on a bedroom floor with a laptop and understanding for the first time that no one was coming and that this was not a tragedy, but an instruction. She wrote about being afraid. She wrote about being angry, more than she usually allowed herself to be, more than she had shown anyone. She wrote about wanting to be seen by her father and knowing, even as she wrote it, that she could not build her life around that wanting. And at the end, in the last paragraph, she wrote, "I don't know how this works out. I don't know if I'm strong enough or smart enough or if the plans I've made will hold. But I know that I am not what he said I was. I know that, I know the room I'm sitting in, not because someone told me, but because I'm here, in it, and it's real. I'll figure the rest out from there." I sat with the letter for a long time. Then I folded it gently, as if it deserved to be handled that way, which it did, and placed it back in the envelope. I put the envelope on top of the green notebook. I closed the box. I didn't throw it away. I put it back on the bookshelf where I could see it, where it belonged, not in the dark of the closet, but in the ordinary light of the room I had built for myself. Then I got up and made coffee and opened the window and let the October air come in. Below on the street, the city was doing what it always did, moving, generating, insisting on itself in every direction at once. delivery trucks and dog walkers, and someone on the corner who was explaining something important on a phone call, arms moving for emphasis. The particular, inexhaustible noise of a place where a great many people have arrived from somewhere else and decided to make something here. I stood at the window with my coffee and listened to it, and thought about a girl who sat on a bedroom floor in Portland at midnight with a laptop and a green notebook and a decision that nobody witnessed and nobody applauded and nobody would have known about if it hadn't led by a long and specific and sometimes very difficult road to everything that came after. That girl is still here. She is who I am underneath everything I have become since. She is the reason I can stand at this window on a Sunday morning and feel, without qualification or footnote, that my life is mine. I didn't need my father to see that. I didn't need anyone to see it, but I see it. Every day, I see it. And that, all along from the very beginning, was the only thing that was ever actually required. If this story stayed with you, if some part of it sounded like something you've lived, or something you've felt, or something you've needed to hear, then I want you to know that it was told for you as much as for me. These are the stories worth telling. Not the easy ones, but the ones where the path was hard and the person walked it anyway. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. It means more than I can say to know that you are here for the whole of it. If this is the first time you found this channel, please consider subscribing. It helps these stories reach the people who need them most. And if you know someone who could use a reminder today that they are not defined by who overlooked them, share this with them. I'll be back with another story soon. Take care of yourselves.